Okay. Good evening, thank you to be here for this seminar, and thank you to Abel Winn to accept to present this paper about the land assembly without eminent domain. It's nice for IBL to have Abel here for, I think, two main reasons. The first one is because the Institute invested a lot in the past in experimental economics, because in Milan, two university as guest Bernard Smith, because from a theoretical point of view, methodological point of view, we believe it's a very, very important field. It's important also in Italy to develop this kind of research. And the second, because the subject is very important for the Institute believing in classical liberalism. Because when you speak about eminent domain, it's clear right. And for people in our tradition, property rights is strictly associated to individual liberty. So thank you to be here, for your time and for your passion, and we are really happy to follow.
Well, let me start by pointing out that Chapman University is in California, and I'm proud to tell you all that Donald Trump lost California by 30 percentage points, so that's good news. I'm ashamed to tell you that Hillary Clinton won by the same amount, but nobody's perfect. So. I want to begin by motivating the talk by giving you an example of the land assembly problem that's actually right outside my office, just across the way from it. This is an interior view of the Musco Center on Chapman University's campus. It was just opened this year. It cost $82 million to build. And it is a state-of-the-art performing arts center and concert hall. This is a view. Oh wow, that's very dark. This is a view from the exterior, and it is an artist's rendition. And of course, it's difficult to see. There are a few. This is the view actually right out of my window, my office. I can turn around and see this. And there are a few details here that are not exactly the way that the building looks. Now to you is, even if the picture were lighter, you wouldn't see any buildings behind the Musco Center. It looks like this is the only one on the block. But if you go to Google Maps and you look at the street view, you will see that right behind the Musco Center, which is here, there's this liquor store, Hooves Liquor Store. This is a piece of property that the university tried to purchase from the owner, and I can show you an aerial photo. Here's the Musco Center, and this area right here, that is the plot of property that we tried to buy. Now, to build the Musco Center, we wanted to use three plots of property. One that we already owned, right? The store was, and one here had a Eastern restaurant. And the university repeatedly made offers to the owner of the liquor store. No, they kept offering more money. And eventually the university said, fine, we'll just build it without your property. Over here, the restaurant, the university made an offer, they turned it down, they made another offer, they turned it down. And then they mysteriously had a fire, and their building burned down, and then they sold to the university instead of rebuilding. I did not mention this here, but both the president and the provost of the university at the time were Italian. I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions about that. But this is an example of what we call the land assembly problem and the holdout problem, where you may have a developer who wants to build a structure that at least ideally would take up multiple separate plots of land owned by different people. And of course, if property rights are strong, then that means that those separate owners are all in a position to hold out for a large share of the surplus. And you end up with this potential paradox where I'm taking it as granted that everyone in this room believes strongly in property rights. and that in general they result, strong property rights result in high efficiencies. But here we have a sort of paradoxical situation where when the property rights are very strong, they could actually sometimes result in a negative outcome or a market failure. Now, I refer to it as a market failure, and the university will look at the situation and say, well, we failed to purchase the property, and more valuable in our hands than in the hands of the liquor store owner. So from our perspective, it certainly looks like a market failure. But as an economist, I do have to point out that we don't have access, we don't really know how much that owner really valued his property. And it is entirely possible that it is a more efficient use of the land to have the liquor store behind our beautiful building. It is a liquor store on a college campus, so it probably has some value, right, to somebody. And so one of the things that this brings up is, in the field, it can be very difficult to tell when is it really a market failure and when is the market really efficient with the expectation of ownership. And that is where laboratory experiments can be value added. In a laboratory experiment, we can recruit human subjects. At Chapman, we have a computer laboratory that we bring to, and we can put them through an experiment where, say, one person in a group, we tell them, you're the buyer. And we say, here are multiple properties. If you can buy all of them, then we'll give you a bonus. We'll pay you some extra money, but we will subtract from that the prices that you paid to everybody else. And so the buyer has an incentive to try to get all the properties, but also to do it at the lowest set of prices that they can. And then we also have sellers in the group, and we can assign them a plot of property and tell them, look, here is your value for this property. If you make it through the experiment without selling, then we'll pay you this amount of money. But if you do sell to the buyer, then instead we'll pay you whatever the price was that he offered you. So they have an incentive to sell at as high a price as possible. And of course, if they turn down an offer that's higher than their value, then they're taking a risk that they won't be earning as much money as they could have otherwise. And the laboratory experiments are useful because, first of all, they let us observe holdout directly. We could say that we observed it in this situation because the liquor store kept refusing, but we didn't have the information to compare our offer against his reservation value, whereas in the laboratory we're telling them what it is, so we can observe it and know when it's occurring. It also lets us measure the economic performance to see how much the gains from trade have been captured, how frequently do land assemblies succeed or fail. And last, and what I'll sort of be focusing on today, we can test different hypothetical mechanisms to see, if we change the rules in this way or that way, are we going to be able to improve the performance? Okay, so you can use it as sometimes experimentalists will refer to this use a test bed, use it as a test bed or a wind tunnel to test alternative policies. There have been a number of experiments run on past, and most of them do show that you can run into the holdout problem, where sellers do turn down offers that are higher than their valuation. And they can cause quite a bit of delay in the experiment and also result in assembly failure. Although of the two, delay and assembly failure tends to be fairly rare. In most of the experiments, they do eventually come up with an assembly. What usually causes the most cost in the system is the delay, where if you impose a delay penalty on people's earnings for every additional round that it takes them to reach an agreement, you find that they lose quite a bit of money that way. These are 5 of the papers in the literature. There's another 4 or 5 that you could look up to see. But basically what we see is it is a problem, although usually not an impossible problem. There are a couple of studies. So the first thing you would say then is, okay, the policy response, the go-to policy response that the government has is to exercise eminent domain. Which of course is telling the owner, you must sell, you don't have the option, and in court we're going to work out what the price is that you sell to us. Now here I should make a brief aside, I think, because my understanding is that property rights over land, and in particular over your home, they sound like they're stronger actually in Europe than in the United States. When I gave this talk in Jürgen Kuber told me that it would be very, very difficult for a municipal government to tell someone, you are out of your house, you must sell your property so that we can build this development. In the United States, that's not so much the case. And in fact, well, our current president, Donald Trump, was sort of famous in the 1980s. He wanted to build a parking lot for one of his Atlantic City casinos and tried to use eminent domain to evict this elderly woman from her property. Now, he was not successful. But in 2006 or 2007, there was a case that went before our Supreme Court where the city of New London in Connecticut, they wanted to aggregate land and give it to Pfizer Corporation to keep them in the city. And they believed that giving the land to the Pfizer Corporation would generate more tax revenue than leaving it in the hands of these 7 private owners. So those 7 owners held out and sued the city and said, this is not a public use of our property because it's not building a road or a park. It's just transferring private property to another private entity. That was argued all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said, no, that is constitutional. A government in the, a local government in the United States, under the Constitution, has the right to transfer private property to another private owner, and claiming that generate more tax revenue counts as public use. Okay, so you can imagine after that there was quite a bit of outrage at the justices. I will point out that it is constitutional to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's legal. There are states where they've passed constitutional amendments or passed laws that say we're not going to allow that to happen. But there's no final guarantor in the Constitution that says that it can't happen. 2 studies, one by myself and one of my co-authors on this paper, have in the laboratory looked at cases where we allow eminent domain and cases where we do not. And in both of these studies, we found there was actually no net improvement in the efficiency. There was a holdout problem, some holdout problem, when there was no eminent domain. But in our experiment, for example, if the buyer exercised eminent domain, what then happened was the buyer and seller had a court battle, and they both could spend money in court trying to push the price up or down, influence it in their behavior. And what we found was, when there was eminent domain, the costs of delay disappeared for the most part. But all of that money that used to disappear in delay, it all got spent in the courts. And so it was a wash. There was no net improvement when you added an eminent domain. So as of right now, as the literature stands, we basically see that there is a problem, but there's no set solution to how to take care of it. And so the paper that I've been working on with Dr. McCarter and Dr. DeSantis is to look at some tax mechanisms to see, can we maybe change the rules of the system in a way that will improve efficiency and reduce the incentives of sellers to hold out. So the first mechanism that we're looking at was recommended by Plotman and Tiedemann in 2008. We also paused for an aside to explain briefly how tax assessment works in the United States. In California, it works this way, and in most states, it's the same. That is that when the government decides to tax your property, they tax it according to an assessed value, and that assessed value is typically determined by the fair market price. And the way that they determine the fair market price is usually just whatever you paid for it. So when you buy a property, when it changes hands, the government looks at that title deed, says this is the assessed value of this property, and then they assess a tax of 1% or 1.5% per year that you have to pay. It can increase from year to year to account for inflation, usually by maybe 2% is the maximum in California. But most of the change in the tax assessment happens when the property changes hands. Or if you own the property for 10 years and you tear your house down and build a new structure, then they will also reassess. So Plotman and Tiedemann say, okay, well, rather than using that price to be the assessed value of the property, what we should do is we should have the seller declare the value of the property. That's why we call it declared assessment. The idea here is that you would basically go into the tax office and you would fill out a form saying, I state that the value of my property is the following amount, $500,000, $400,000, whatever it is. Now, the first thing that you might say is, well, if they're going to use the number that I write down to assess my taxes, why don't I just say 0? I'll write a big 0 then, hand it in, I'm good to go. And then I don't owe any taxes. Well, the way that they recommend that you guard against that is that the declaration is binding. So you write it down, you hand it into the tax office. A developer then, if they want to assemble some properties, they don't have to go to you to bargain. Instead, they go to the tax office, they look at the number you wrote down, and if they're willing to pay that price, then they inform you of that, and then you must sell your property. Okay, so that keeps people from understating the value of the property. Why wouldn't they then hold out instead? Maybe I want to inflate this value so that I get paid more in the case that a developer wants to buy my property. Well, the way that you prevent that is by using a tax formula that is, I'll show you in a slide or two, gives people an incentive not to overstate. Okay, if you use a tax formula that is developed correctly, you can make it so that it is a dominant strategy to truly deal with the value of your property. Now, this tax mechanism with a tax formula has nice theoretical properties, but you can imagine some difficulties in actually implementing it. One is that the tax formula is complicated, and the tax formula has to be different for every single owner, or at least it could theoretically be different for every single landowner. So the government would have to assess a tax formula for every different person individually. The government may also not have the information that is truly necessary to set it up in an incentive-compatible way. And also, it's most likely the case that while my tax formula will be based on the price that I declare, if somebody wants to acquire my property, they probably also want to buy some of my neighbor's properties as well. And so it turns out that if I set my assessment high, that lowers the probability everyone else is going to sell, and that's also going to reduce their taxes, and vice versa. So you may have this problem where neighbors can collusively overstate their value and hold out together. So that brings us to the mechanism that Mark DeSantis and I wanted to test, because when we tried the tax formula in the lab, as I'll show you, it works pretty well. So we wanted to see, okay, well, what if we simplified things? And instead of using this complicated tax formula, we just change it so that it's a flat tax rate, okay? In our lab experiments, we used a flat tax rate of 10%. In the field, it would be much more than that, but that had some nice properties. It was simple to calculate for the subjects, and it was enough money that it should actually matter to them. And so our thinking was, okay, the status quo is maybe here, that we use a tax formula, we do considerably better. What if we just use a tax rate, maybe it'll be somewhere in between, and that would be at least a net improvement over the status quo. So how do these mechanisms work? Well, the declared assessment with a tax formula, to work through a little bit of the math, that V represents the developer's value for a set of properties. And for our experiments, we assumed that the value of the properties had perfect complementarity, meaning that, remember Chapman said, okay, fine, we'll do without that one small property and we'll still build something, it's just not worth as much. In our experiments, that's not an option. They have to get all the properties or they can't build their structure. R represents the seller's reservation value for his property. So if you put him in an incentive compatible mechanism, and you can get the lowest willingness to sell out of him, it's represented by the letter R. And the sellers make a binding price declaration for that as X. Then we have two functions of X. One is P of X, which gives us the probability that the developer is going to purchase the land. Of course, that's going to be bounded between 0 and 1, and the derivative will be negative, meaning that the higher the assessment you submit, the lower the probability that a developer will want to purchase it, and then let T of X be an as yet unspecified tax formula, and of course that's going to be increasing typically in your assessment, increasing in tax. So if you have a neutral landowner who's a seller, this works, by the way, the seller is risk averse, but it's easier to see the math at work if we assume risk neutrality. The expected utility is given by the probability that purchases the property at price of X, and if that happens, your payoff is the price that you declared minus the tax that has been assessed to you. Probability that the developer purchase property, and in that case, you earn your reservation value for the land, again minus the tax that has been assessed to you. Notice that in this case, the seller must pay the tax whether this property sells or not. In the status quo, you only pay the tax to the government if you own the property for the full year. Otherwise, you pay just a pro rata percentage of it. All right, so if you want to find the X that optimizes this utility function, you can find the first order condition by taking the derivative and setting it equal to 0, and that gives you the expression up here. Okay, and I want to draw your attention to the following. In the first order condition, you have this green term, P of X, that's the probability that you're going to sell your property. And this red term, the derivative of the tax function, well, that's just telling you the marginal tax rate. Okay, notice that if these two expressions are equal to each other for every value of X, then these cancel out. In that case, you're left only with the terms in black, and notice that in that case, if X is equal to R, that is, if your declaration is equal to your reservation value, then this will also equal 0, and you will have satisfied your first order condition. Okay? That means that if you want a tax function that is always equal to the probability at any given level of X, what you need to know is what is the probability function. You take the, you integrate that probability function, and that will give you the tax that somebody owes you at a particular declaration. And now, of course, you can see why this runs into difficulty. The government needs to know the probability function for every landowner, or at least the landowners need to believe that the government knows the probability function, which maybe they won't even believe that if the government does know it. They must calculate this for every landowner, and the probability functions are probably going to be interdependent of each other. Okay, my declaration affects my neighbor's probabilities as well as affecting my own. So the alternative with the tax rate theoretically does not look nearly as pretty. So now we just tau representing tax rate on land. In the field, again, that's usually probably going to be 1% or maybe less. In the experiments, tau was 10%. And so now the first order condition is going to be with these two terms, P of X and tau. And now it would strictly be a coincidence if these two equaled each other and your best option was to truthfully reveal. Instead, typically, expected utility is going to be maximized where you have your reservation value, and then you subtract this term from it. Now notice the denominator is negative always, so the question of whether you're overstating your value or understating your value is dependent on whether the probability or the tax rate is higher. If the probability is higher, then you should overstate your value. If the tax rate is higher, then you should understate your value. Okay? This does not have good theoretical properties to get people to tell the truth. And I'll also tell you that in our experiments, the holdout problem was, at least theoretically, particularly stark. The average reservation value that our subjects had was $125,000 experimental dollars. But if you calculated their equilibrium declaration, at $125,000, they should be declaring $256,000, so more than double the truth, okay? So we would have no good reason to tell a policymaker to try this unless we had good evidence from the lab that people seem to do okay with it anyway. Okay. The experiment design is up here. We ran a baseline case. That was a typical back and forth negotiation between a human buyer and 4 human sellers. And then we have a declared formula and declared rate treatment. In each of them, the declared formula and the rate, of course, everybody's just writing down a number and submitting it, all the buyer has to do is compare the sum of those to the value. So we did it without a human buyer in that case. We didn't want to pay someone just to compare, so we just used the computer and informed the subjects that the computer would be adding up the prices and comparing them. We ran 3 sessions of each. In each session, there were 10 negotiations. And so that gives us 30 total negotiations for each of the treatments. I'll also point out that for the negotiations, we drew values for the buyers and drew values for the sellers from known distributions. We drew enough of those for 30 negotiations, and then we used those same value draws in every single treatment, so that in each treatment, sellers saw exactly the same thing in exactly the same order. So any differences between the 2 treatments should simply be due to differences in the negotiating mechanisms that were available to them. So here's the economic environment in the baseline. There's 4 sellers. We drew their reservation values from a uniform distribution with a lower bound of 100,000 and an upper bound of 150,000 experimental dollars, and the exchange rate was, I believe, 16,000 experimental dollars to $1 US. There was 1 buyer per group. The buyer's value was drawn between 300,000 and $1.25 million experimental dollars. The buyer also had an endowment of cash equal to 350,000 experimental dollars. That endowment of cash was not a budget constraint. It was an opportunity cost. So if he didn't think it was going to be worth his time, they could look at their value ahead of time and decide whether or not to negotiate. If they didn't want to, they could just walk away with the cash on hand. The value draws were private information. So everyone knew the distributions, but nobody knew the exact draws except the ones that they had received themselves. The cash was also private information. We told the sellers the buyer did have this opportunity cost, but we did not inform them how much it was. And there were 5 periods that they could negotiate in to reach a settlement. If they didn't reach a settlement by the end of the 5th period, then the negotiation was over and no purchase took place. The buyer, time was of the essence to the buyer. So we imposed a delay penalty on the buyer's earnings. The sellers did not incur a penalty because we were assuming you live at your house throughout this negotiation, you're still getting your consumption value out of it. But for the buyer, every additional period that it took to purchase properties resulted in a 5% deduction in their earnings. So we gave them a multiplier that was 100%, purchased them all by the end of period 1, 95% at the end of period 2, and so on. The institution, the bargaining institution, worked as follows. First of all, before anything happened in terms of negotiation, we gave the sellers time to talk to each other over a chat log that they had on their screens. We gave them 7 minutes to do that in the first period. After that, all of the sellers submitted a price request to the buyer. Price request was not binding. They could turn down offers that were higher than the price request if they wanted. It was a cheap talk signal to just say, hey, this is how much I would like you to offer me for my property. But as a cheap talk signal, the buyer had no incentive to actually respond to it. The buyer then would look at the requests, then decide whether or not to actually make offers. And if he decided to make offers, then he made them to all of the sellers who had not sold their property. The sellers then had 1 minute to look at the offers that they had received and talk to each other about them, and then they accepted or rejected their offer. The buyer's earnings were a little bit complicated. If they didn't buy any of the parcels of property, then they just received their cash payment of C. If they purchased all 4 of the parcels, then their payment was equal to the cash endowment plus their value for those 4 parcels. But then they had to pay the prices that they had agreed to. They had to pay those to the sellers, and they had to pay a 10% tax. And that tax was assessed on the basis of the price that they had paid. And that 1.1 times the price of the parcels. The worst situation for the buyer was if they were able to purchase some of the properties, but not all of the properties. So if they purchased 1 to 3 of them, they still got their cash, but they still had to pay all of the sellers the agreed upon price. However, we did allow them to cut their losses. If they purchased 1 or more properties, but not all of them, the purchase price went to the seller, but then the experimenter bought the properties back from the developer at a price of $100,000, which is the lower bound of the value distribution for the buyers. So effectively what we're assuming is there's a market price of $100,000. If they're unable to capture all 4 of the properties, then they sell back the ones that they did purchase on the open market, and their loss is equal to the difference between the price they agreed to pay the seller and the market price that they get when they sell back onto the market. Sellers' earnings were much simpler. The sellers got the price that they had been offered if they accepted. Otherwise, they got the reservation value minus 10% of the assessed property value, which was $400,000. Okay, so we just subtracted $10,000 experimental dollars from their value if they held on to their property. The offers and the earnings were all private, although we did allow the sellers to talk to each other about the offers that had been made to them. But accepted offers were public because in reality, if your neighbor sells their house, you can go down and look at the deed and see the price. This is the screen that the subject saw. And you can see that we have a setup here where they were told which lot belonged to them and which house. Before you had sold your property, your house was red. If you sold, then the icon turned green with some stacks of cash coming out of it, and the price was displayed so everybody could see. Also, if you sold your property, you could no longer communicate because you'd moved out of the neighborhood. And we told them what their lot number was and their value. When they received an offer, they got information on the side telling them if you accept the offer, this is how much you'll earn. If you reject the offer and never sell, that's the amount that you'll earn. And they had a reminder of the value ranges, the distributions as well. And this was their the chat log. For the declared formula treatment, the probability that the buyer wants to purchase your property is given by subtracting the prices that have been declared. So this is your price, or my price as the individual owner. This is the sum of all my neighbors' prices, X, not I. So to find the probability that a buyer wants to purchase, we need to find the probability that he got a value draw that was bigger than the sum of our declarations. You can find out by taking the upper bound of the buyer's uniform distribution, subtracting out the prices that we requested, and then dividing by the difference between the upper and lower bound of the buyer's distribution, which is 950,000. So this gives the probability function. If you integrate that over X, this gives you a tax function as follows: 2.5 million times my declaration minus my declaration squared minus 2 times my declaration and the sum of the product of my declaration and the sum of everybody else's, divided by 1.9 million. The sellers earned their declared price minus the tax if they sold, their reservation value minus the tax if they did not sell. I don't have a specific slide for the declared tax rate, but it's just a simpler idea where the tax is 10% of whatever number you write down. And this is what the screen looked like if you were in one of the declared institutions. Everything is exactly the same, except we added a graphing tool to the lower left. And what this does is the following. You type in, a seller could type in the declarations that they believed that their neighbors would make. And then they could specify if they wanted to graph out the tax formula or if they wanted to graph out their expected earnings. They selected that here, then they clicked to generate the graph. And we would graph out for them what that looked like. So this is what the tax formula looked like for this subject. And if they switch that to their expected earnings, they would have seen an upside down U shape. And we didn't point this out to them, but if they just always looked at the top of where it peaked, they would have seen that it was right above their value. Any questions before I go into the results? Okay. So So the first thing that we looked at is what's the rate of holdout. Now we define holdout in the baseline to mean I rejected at least one offer that was higher than my reservation value. And we define holdout in the declared assessment treatments to mean I specified a price that was higher than my reservation value. Remember that for the tax formula, theoretically we expect no holdout. Everybody should be just honestly telling the truth unless they're colluding with each other. For the tax rate, we expect 100 people to hold out. And the baseline, it's an open question. We don't know what to expect. Okay, what did we actually see? Well, the first slide is not very encouraging. Okay, tax formula, well, about half of the sellers held out. They turned down at least one offer that was above their value. The tax formula was completely counterproductive. It was supposed to get everybody to tell the truth. In fact, almost everybody overstated what their value was. There were, I think, a total of 4 sellers, maybe 5, who put in a declaration that was at or below their value, and the tax rate close to 100%, but not quite. Okay, so this is not a big surprise. A little bit better than we would have expected. That does not fit in very well with theory. So we compare these with a legislation that controls for the treatment. It also controls for the negotiation number that they're in, and we cluster the errors by group. Because since the sellers were allowed to talk to each other, we assume that they're influencing one another's decisions. And what we see is that definitely statistically significant difference between the baseline and the tax formula treatment. Also a significant difference between the baseline and the tax rate treatment. These two, no significant difference. And that's the case on all of these slides. There's never a difference, statistically significant difference between the performance of the formula and tax rates treatments, right? So first slide, not particularly encouraging. The next thing that we can ask though is, how much were they holding out for? Okay, what's the magnitude of their holdout? For the baseline, we calculate that by taking the highest offer that they rejected value, and that counts as the magnitude. And we only include them in this calculation if they did hold out. If they never held out, then we don't include them. And of course, for the formula and the rate, we take the price that they declared, subtract out their value, and the difference is the holdout. And here are the numbers here. Now it looks a little bit, maybe a little bit more optimistic. So the baseline was 34,500. By the way, what I'm showing you here is not the means, it's the medians. The reason for that is in the tax formula, the median was very close, 30,000 compared to 34,500. But there was one group that did work out that, hey, if we all hold out together, if we all ask for a huge amount of money, nobody pays any taxes, and we'll do much better. And so everybody in that one group asked for at least $1 million. And as you can imagine, that skews the average considerably. So the medians are very similar. Tax rate, remember that I told you that in equilibrium, if my value is 125,000, I'm asking for 256. So you expect it to go as high as maybe 130,000. In fact, it was substantially less than that, about $50,000 that they're holding out for at the median. If we compare these using the same control variables, but doing an OLS regression, there's no significant difference between the baseline and the tax formula treatment. And there's also no significant difference between the baseline and the tax rate treatment. Okay, so this is more encouraging than the first slide that we saw. Now, looking at the actual outcomes, the next thing we ask is, what about the rate of assembly? What percent of the time was the buyer actually able to purchase all 4 properties? And I'll point out here that in those negotiations, there were 30 negotiations in each. In 6 of them, the seller's values added up together was higher than the buyer's value, and so we don't want assembly to take place in those 6. So what I'm looking at here is, what's the rate of assembly in the 24 negotiations where it was efficient for the buyer to purchase the properties, okay? And what we see now is significantly more encouraging. So in the baseline, 50% of the negotiations that should have ended in assembly actually did. That's 12 out of the 24, which is a pretty poor rate, especially if you compare it to other studies that have been done before. This is one of the lower rates of assembly that I have seen. Okay, now I will say that it did tend to be the case that the more money was on the line, the more gains from trade that were available, the more likely they were to assemble. Okay, so this 50% isn't just a random draw of the available negotiations. It skews towards the most valuable negotiations. Also, one thing about this 50%, a good chunk of that does seem to have occurred from buyers who were discouraged. They made more than one offer that they thought was fair. It was turned down, and so the buyer just walked away from the negotiating table. In the tax formula and tax rate treatments, despite the fact that most everybody held out, they mostly did not hold out by enough to make the buyer want to walk away. And these were also heavily skewed towards the most valuable. So the 17% or so that were not being assembled, those tended to be the ones where there was very little money on the line, and it was enough that everybody holding out was enough to make the prices higher than the value. But as soon as the buyer's value was substantially more than the seller's, then the holdout or the overstating of their values didn't really make that much of a difference. Okay, and there is a statistically significant difference between the baseline and formula treatments. Also a statistically significant difference between the baseline and the tax rate treatment. Okay, so now things were looking considerably better. You can also look at not just what percent of the transactions went through, but how much of the total gains from trade were captured in each of these treatments. Now, most commonly, if you're reading like market experiments, they will test for capturing gains from exchange by measuring what we call efficiency, where they say, okay, this is the amount of money that they actually earned in the negotiation. We divide that by the maximum amount of money that they could have earned in the negotiation, and that fraction tells us how efficient the market was. For these negotiations, we don't think that's the right way, the best way to look at it, because there was such a spread of how much money was available. So in these gains from exchange, in those 24 negotiations where it was positive, the smallest amount of gains from trade was $5,000. Okay, the greatest amount of gains from trade was $765,000. Now, if I get 100% of the $5,000, but only 80% of the $765,000, I would rather get the 80% of the $765,000. But if I'm normalizing by how much was available, the $5,000 looks bigger than the $765,000. So what I'm going to show you here is just the total amount of gains from exchange that were achieved in each of the treatments. And here, once again, both of the experimental treatments did substantially better than the baseline. The baseline, I should point out, there were just a little bit less than $9.1 million available in exchange. In the baseline, they captured a little more than $3.7 million of that available surplus, which is about 41% of the gains from exchange. With the tax formula, they captured about 92%, so almost 8.4 million. And in the tax rate, they captured 98%, $8.9 million, roughly. This is due partially, the low performance in the baseline is due partially to the fact that they only got half of the negotiations completed. That accounts for about 55% of the difference between the baseline and the tax formula treatment. But the other 45% just comes from the costs of delay, from the fact that they had 5 periods to negotiate in. Successful negotiations, on average, took about 4.2 negotiations. So right off the top, those buyers are losing an average of 20% or so of their available surplus, and that took a significant toll. Okay, and you can imagine the differences between the treatments significant, highly significant between the baseline and the formula, and also highly significant between the baseline and the rate. And what was music to our ears is the fact that, remember, we were hoping that this tax rate treatment would maybe come out somewhere in the middle, right? Because it didn't have as nice properties, but we were thinking, well, as long as it does better than this, then we have something to tell the policymakers. But actually, it did slightly better than the tax formula, and there's no significant difference between these two. So it seems like, at least in the lab, we could make that adjustment with no loss to the performance of the mechanism. Okay. Last two result slides that I'll talk to you about, and that is sort of getting at the idea of, is there a constituency that should be opposed to changing from the status quo to one of these experimental treatments, right? Because it's great that we're getting a lot more money, but if sellers maybe are getting less surplus in these two treatments than they are in the baseline, they might be opposed to, well, we would expect them to be opposed to the rules. So the last thing to ask is losers moving from the baseline to the formula. Does either side of the market on average do worse? Okay? And more encouraging news, if we look at just the seller surplus, is that the answer appears to be no. There is a decrease of about $700,000 in the surplus that was captured by the sellers in the formula versus the baseline, but that difference is not statistically significant, so we would expect them to do just as well under the rule change. And in the tax rate, notice that the sellers actually captured a little bit more than they did in the baseline, although again, that difference is not statistically significant. Okay, so sellers do not appear to be made any worse off, so they have no, at least financial reason to oppose. And the buyers, the sellers are no worse off, the buyers are even happier. Okay, this is the buyer's surplus in the baseline. Only about 200,000 of that 3.7 million was ultimately captured by the buyers. Now, this hides a little bit of something, which is that if you take those 50% of buyers who managed to successfully negotiate and get all four of their properties, they got more than 207,000. Okay, they were able to capture it, but only half of them were able to do so. The other half lost money. So you have 50% of the buyers making some amount of money, the other 50% losing, and if you add the gains and the losses together, the gains only slightly beat out the losses. And if you were to look at the median amount of surplus that the buyers captured, the median is negative. It's negative 35,000. So from the buyer's perspective, we're looking at this as kind of a static. You just get one negotiation and then you move on. But if you look at this maybe in more dynamic terms, where a developer is considering whether to even start approaching sellers, this environment where they have about a 50% chance of losing money and only a 50% chance of earning money, this is a risky business environment to be in. And I would expect that probably there are just going to be fewer attempts and fewer developments that get thought out in the first place. Whereas in the tax formula and tax rate treatments, they captured over 5 million in both cases, 5.6 million for the formula, 5.1 million in the tax rate. And of course, the differences are highly significant. This is not statistically significantly different between the formula and the tax rate. Okay, so to sum up, we tested these two assessment mechanisms. We were, pleasantly surprised by how well both of them did in the lab. One possible objection that I can imagine for either mechanism is what landowners may have perhaps non-financial reasons to be opposed to the idea that anybody can come along and purchase their property once they've rid of that price tag. If you are not getting along well with your neighbor and he's wealthier than you are, well, then maybe he goes to the tax office, buys your house from you, and kicks the curb, and you have to go find someplace else to live. Unless you're the one who thinks of it first. But so it could be that what the government would want to do, instead of making this a broad general rule that anyone may purchase your property, they could instead perhaps use it as a strict substitute for eminent domain, where if they were going to, if the government was going to foreclose on your house and force you to sell, that's the only time they would allow a developer to go in, take a look at the prices, and then they say, instead of going to the court, we just go into the tax office and see what you told us you would sell your property for. Directions for future research. One is I'd like to run some experiments using the same setup that we did in our baseline, where we allow the buyer to exercise eminent domain, because the two papers I told you about before had somewhat different negotiating situations where the buyer did not have to purchase any of the properties unless all of the sellers had agreed. So they used contingent contracts. This experiment, we used non-contingent contracts. And it would be nice if we could show that eminent domain is, assuming this is the case, it would be nice to show eminent domain being less efficient and less good for buyers and sellers than the alternative tax mechanisms that we're proposing. And then there are a couple of other mechanisms that have been put out there by other researchers. One is that might be worth exploring in the lab. One is what's called the Special Purpose Development Corporation. That was proposed by Lahavi and Licht in 2007. Their idea is, this is again sort of a supplement to eminent domain, that instead of the government taking you to court to determine the price, they still give you that option. They say, if you want, we'll go into court, we'll negotiate the price out there. Or the other option is we're going to set up this Special Purpose Development Corporation, and we're going to give you shares in that development corporation. So whatever percent of the total land that's being assembled, that's your percent ownership of this corporation. Once we have gotten all of the owners into the corporation, the corporation will then hold an auction to sell all those properties off to the highest bidding developer, and then it will pay out the proceeds of that auction in proportion to how much of your land was put in there. And that might be a way of helping to make sure that the sellers are completely compensated for the property that has been taken from them. And then the last idea is by Heller and Hills in 2008, which are land assembly districts. And you can think of a land assembly district as basically hyper-localizing an eminent domain decision. So instead of having the government of the entire city tell you when you must sell your property, they divide the city into smaller districts called assembly districts. If a developer wants to purchase property in that land assembly district, they go and talk to the owners in that district, make an offer for the properties, and then the owners hold a vote. And if a sufficiently high majority of the owners vote, then they sell the properties. And so if your neighbors outvote you, then you have to sell. So it's still eminent domain. It can still result in somebody not receiving fair compensation for their property, but you can imagine your neighbors maybe being more having your interests at heart more than the municipal government. And one of the problems that you can run into, especially in the United States with eminent domain, is if the developer is politically connected to the city government, then you can run into real problems where they can just be kicking people out of their houses at unfair prices. That's much less likely to happen in the land assembly district. So that is the research. Thank you for attending, and if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to address.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. So I am not an economist, so please, I'm sorry if I go into social science. But, what I want to raise up is that example came to my mind, which is Val di Susa, which is a place in northern Italy. That's an example of eminent domain, actually, but let me explain why there is listed. Which there, like a very big coalition of owners has formed in last years, basically in opposition to a very large project of eminent domain due to the will to build a high-speed railway between Italy and France. And so what happened is that, or my impression is that that thing became a big thing, and like newspapers talk about it and everything. especially because there were many people pushing for this. So my question is, I was wondering whether like a variation in the number of sellers could impact your research, because my sensation is that an increasing number of sellers can actually, you know, form like coalitions or, you know, like people.
Right. So first, a question before I respond. All of those homeowners in the coalition, were they all going to have their property taken, or were these? In the United States, there's also a phenomenon that we refer to as NIMBYs.
Oh yeah,
not in my backyard.
Yeah.
So were these people all folks whose property was actually on the line, or was a lot of the coalition just people who were opposed to building it and they just didn't want it to happen?
Like starting like at the start like that, and then we get
okay. All right. So a couple of things on that. First of all, absolutely, the more sellers there are, the bigger the problem becomes, especially if you're involved in negotiation. Okay. So there are theoretical papers on that. At least one of the experimental papers tested. They looked at 2 cases with 2. I mean, in the lab, we're not going to have really massive groups because it would be very expensive. But they went from 2 to 3 to 4 sellers, and they definitely found it gets stickier. The more sellers you have, the less likely you are to reach an agreement. Now, that is one of the advantages of if you get everyone to pre-commit to a price, then it doesn't matter. Doesn't take that much longer to look through 100 cards in the index as it does to look through 5. So it wouldn't be such a big problem. I think that it would be NIMBYism is becoming something that's a bit close to my heart, because I live in Southern California, where there are a lot of people that are opposed, not just to building. I mean, I can sort of imagine the real concern that you have building a high-speed rail, and there's negative externalities on the property. In Southern California, but also especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's large groups of homeowners who simply don't want more houses to be built and simply don't want more development. Partly because they don't want to change the character of the neighborhood, and they don't want these newcomers to come in and change what they knew, but also in part because they want the value of their homes to stay high, and they want to use the municipal government to restrict the supply and keep the price high. So I think it would be very interesting to run experiments. The economics profession seems to be focused mostly on the problem of holdouts. This guy doesn't want to sell me his property, and so that causes a problem. I've seen much less discussion of, and I suspect it's a much bigger problem, of NIMBYism, and because you can imagine, it's not just these 5 or 10 sellers that I have to negotiate. It's their 150 neighbors that just don't want the development to occur. They don't own the land. I'm not actually imposing on their property. And I'm not sure what the sense is in the room, but my classical liberal principles, my take on it is, look, when you bought your land, you bought your land. And you did not buy the right to what happens in the city generally. So you shouldn't have endless opportunities to stop development. I think that is a very interesting avenue for future research, and hopefully in the next couple of years. First, I want to see if there are any good models that have already been done of this, and if so, I can just test them in the lab. Otherwise, I'll be probably looking for some co-authors to look into it. But definitely, that can be an issue, and necessarily have to be a large number of sellers. Sometimes, I think, as long as there is public pressure or a lot of eyes on it, that can really slow down development. Trump was unsuccessful largely because this was a woman who it was a very sympathetic case, and so she got plenty of coverage on the news, and yeah, exactly. So I think that matters a lot.
About this new situation, about this Sousa case, I have the impression that many times, generally, we have very, very important things to do, but we don't have money to pay. So I'm not sure that it's very, very big business. But it's supposed to be a very, very big business.
Right.
But maybe
we can't.
Yeah, so you are not ready to spend money to buy the right to use them.
Yes.
So it's a very technical process.
So they must be massive positive externalities, but not.
It's really a very big project, but if you have to pay, your externality is not so.
Exactly, and yeah, you can run into some interesting things with that because, I mean, on the one hand, I can't imagine that there's maybe some reputational reasons why you don't just cave and pay people what they ask for, because the same reason why a lot of large corporations don't settle out of court, because once you do that, then you're informing all the lawyers that it's your appeal ticket. On the other hand, you can have situations where there was a city, Modesto, California, where they wanted to expand something that was going to encroach on a woman's land. They didn't need the whole parcel; they just wanted to buy a section of it. And she held out that she wasn't willing to sell for the price that they were offering her. And the city ended up, they spent $180,000 fighting in court, and the price they ended up paying her was $120,000. So, there was probably some Cosian bargaining that could have happened there and made it, better, but it can kind of fall on both sides. Well, if that's
No, that's all. Okay.
Maybe in experimental detail. So, if I well understood, you said that in the baseline group, they had a lower number of periods to negotiate.
5 periods, yes.
Okay, and doesn't this worry you about the learning effect? Maybe?
That if they that I cut it too short, possibly. There's sort of a trade-off. So when there have been experiments published before where they do single period, and they also will have 10 period with no cost of negotiation, and then there's also 10 period with a cost of negotiation. And what you tend to find is if you go from 1 period to 10, then the assembly rate tends to go up because there is this sort of learning effect where I just happen to offer too low, or I underestimated how much I wanted for this property. One person turns me down, and the negotiation fails. So giving multiple periods does seem to help. If you go to 10 periods and no cost, then I think the average negotiation takes about 7 periods. And then if you impose a cost, then that shortens the negotiations. And most of the time, I'd have to go back and look at the papers, but I believe they usually conclude in about 4 to 5 negotiation periods. We thought, okay, probably 5 periods is enough to make this work. And we also gave them a total of 2 negotiations to go through. So that's different from the other experiments I've seen. Usually they do 1 and then they're finished. With ours, they did 1 negotiation up to 5 periods. Then we gave them a second negotiation to make sure that the negotiations were independent of each other. We always, for the baseline, we always recruited 25 subjects to come into the lab, and we divided them into 5 groups. In the second negotiation, we reorganized them into new groups, and they were completely unique. So you were never grouped with anybody twice. They were always completely new. So in the second negotiation, you were more experienced, but you weren't dealing with anybody else. So it's possible, but I think for the most part, it was probably taken care of.
buyers or buyers for both the negotiations?
Yes, yeah, they were always buyers. Sometimes, now we did, you sometimes run into a question of if you have multiple roles where people sort of putting themselves in the other person's role when they were making their offers or accepting or rejecting. So sometimes experimenters like to switch roles in between so that you'll be paying attention to both sides. We didn't have enough people to make everybody do both because there's always one buyer to four sellers, so we kept them the same. But we did not tell them ahead of time what their role was going to be. We took everybody through all the instructions. We told them, if you're a buyer, this is what's going to happen, and this is how you'll get paid. If you're a seller, this is what will happen, and this is how you'll be paid. When the experiment began, that's when they found out what it was. So our reasoning, our hope is that, okay, everybody's kind of thinking about what would I do in both of these circumstances while they're getting the instructions. And so, hopefully they're putting themselves in the other person's position. That did have a bit of an effect on the rate of assembly. The more surplus was on the line, the more likely it was to occur in the baseline. But also the second negotiation, they were less likely. So possibly experience on the seller side got them to hold out for more. Or, you know what, the other possibility is, I'll need to look into this a little bit more closely. I wouldn't be surprised if buyers who got their fingers burned in the first negotiation did not negotiate as long in the second one, they or just didn't try at all and moved on.
And you had 15 groups per treatment, right?
Total of 30 negotiations, so 6 setups of 5 groups each.
Other question? If not, thank you for your presentation.
If anybody is interested in the